If someone from 50 years ago suddenly appeared in today's world, they would probably think humanity had entered an age of crisis. Wars spreading across nations, economic instability affecting entire populations, moral confusion everywhere, families weakening, anxiety rising globally, violence becoming normal entertainment, truth constantly debated, fear spreading faster than facts. And yet, despite all of this, most people still continue life as though everything is completely normal. That contradiction may be one of the strangest signs of our time. Because deep down, many people know something is wrong. They feel it when they watch the news. They feel it when they look at society. They feel it when they see how quickly the world is changing. But instead of stopping to ask deeper questions, most people distract themselves and continue moving forward as if nothing significant is happening. And perhaps that is exactly what makes this generation so unique. Jesus once warned about a period in history where humanity would continue daily life normally right before sudden destruction arrived. In Matthew 24, he compared the last days to the days of Noah. People were eating, drinking, marrying, buying, selling, building, and planning for the future, completely absorbed in ordinary life, until judgment came suddenly upon them. That comparison is deeply unsettling when viewed through the modern world, because the danger Jesus described was not obvious panic, it was normalcy during increasing corruption. In Noah's generation, society became deeply violent and morally corrupted. Genesis 6 says the earth was filled with wickedness continually. Yet, despite the spiritual collapse happening around them, people carried on with normal routines. They continued living as if consequences would never come. Now compare that to modern society. People wake up, go to work, scroll endlessly through social media, chase money, pursue entertainment, and plan years into the future while the world around them grows increasingly unstable. Wars escalate globally, corruption spreads openly, moral boundaries disappear rapidly, natural disasters intensify, fear and anxiety rise across nations. Yet most people adapt emotionally to all of it so quickly that abnormal conditions begin feeling normal. And this is where a dangerous psychological pattern appears: normalization. Human beings have an incredible ability to adapt to changing environments. What once shocked people eventually becomes familiar through repetition. Violence becomes normal. Corruption becomes expected. Deception becomes routine. Society slowly adjusts to conditions that previous generations would have found deeply alarming. But what happens when people normalize spiritual decline itself? That may be exactly what Jesus was warning about. Because Noah's generation did not collapse in a single moment. Their moral sensitivity eroded gradually. Corruption increased slowly until society became spiritually numb. And once spiritual numbness spreads widely enough, people stop recognizing danger even while standing directly inside it. That is why modern society feels so strange. The signs are visible everywhere, yet awareness remains surprisingly low. People are surrounded by instability, but distraction keeps them emotionally occupied. Entertainment keeps attention fragmented. Constant stimulation prevents deep reflection. And without reflection, people rarely stop long enough to ask the most important question: what if humanity is repeating the same spiritual patterns that existed before previous biblical judgments? That possibility becomes even more disturbing when we realize how often Scripture warns about suddenness. Jesus repeatedly emphasized that many people would be caught completely unprepared because life appeared normal on the surface. And maybe that is the greatest deception of all. Not convincing people that evil does not exist, but convincing them that increasing instability is simply the new normal. One of the most fascinating things about human psychology is something experts call normalcy bias. It is the tendency for people to assume that life will continue normally even when warning signs are clearly visible. In dangerous situations, many individuals delay reacting because their minds resist accepting that major disruption is actually possible. And when you understand this concept, many biblical warnings suddenly become much clearer. Because throughout Scripture, humanity repeatedly ignored warnings while convincing themselves everything would continue as usual. Noah warned his generation for years, yet people dismissed him because daily life still looked stable. Lot warned about judgment before the destruction of Sodom, yet people continued their routines without concern. Prophets warned entire nations about moral collapse while society mocked them and carried on normally. The pattern never changes. People often assume stability right before disruption arrives. Now look honestly at modern society. Despite growing global instability, most people still believe humanity is progressing safely forward. Technology creates the illusion of control. Entertainment creates distraction. Modern systems create comfort. And because many aspects of life still function normally on the surface, people assume deeper collapse cannot happen. But history repeatedly proves otherwise. Civilizations often appear strongest shortly before decline accelerates. Ancient Rome looked powerful externally, even while internal corruption weakened its foundations. Wealth, entertainment, political influence, and military strength masked deeper moral decay happening underneath. And by the time collapse became obvious, the foundation had already been compromised for generations. This is what makes Jesus' warning so important. He emphasized awareness, not panic, watchfulness, not fear, because the greatest danger was not simply external events, it was spiritual unpreparedness caused by distraction and false security. And modern culture is built almost entirely around distraction. People are constantly consuming content, endless scrolling, endless entertainment, endless noise. Attention spans shrink while stimulation increases. Reflection becomes rare. Silence becomes uncomfortable. And in a world addicted to constant stimulation, deeper spiritual awareness becomes increasingly difficult. That may explain why so many people feel emotionally exhausted today. The human mind was not designed for non-stop stimulation combined with global awareness of every crisis happening everywhere simultaneously. People are absorbing fear, anger, division, confusion, and instability constantly through screens without realizing how deeply it shapes emotional perception. But instead of slowing down to reflect, society speeds up even more. And perhaps that is why Jesus repeatedly used the word watch. Watching requires awareness, attention, discernment. It requires people to step outside distraction long enough to recognize patterns forming around them. But modern society rarely pauses long enough to see the larger picture. And the larger picture is becoming harder to ignore. Because the world is not simply experiencing isolated problems anymore. Multiple systems appear strained simultaneously, economically, morally, politically, emotionally, and spiritually. Everything feels unstable at the same time. Yet despite this convergence, humanity continues functioning as though the future remains guaranteed. That confidence itself may be part of the warning, because 1 Thessalonians 5 describes a generation saying peace and safety right before sudden destruction comes unexpectedly upon them. The danger was not only external instability, it was misplaced confidence during instability. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What if the greatest risk facing modern humanity is not ignorance of world events, but spiritual overconfidence during prophetic conditions?
Perhaps the clearest sign that society is spiritually distracted is how quickly people move on from major events. A disaster shocks the world for a few days, then disappears beneath the next wave of headlines. A war dominates attention briefly, then becomes background noise. Corruption is exposed publicly, yet outrage fades almost immediately. This cycle reveals something deeper than short attention spans. It reveals desensitization. Human beings are becoming emotionally numb through constant exposure to crisis. The more frequently society encounters chaos, the less strongly it reacts. Over time, even serious warning signs begin feeling ordinary. And once abnormal conditions become emotionally normal, awareness begins to disappear. This is exactly why biblical warnings emphasize spiritual wakefulness. Because spiritual sleep does not mean physical inactivity, it means reduced awareness during important moments. A person can be extremely busy, highly informed, constantly connected, and still spiritually asleep to the deeper meaning of what is happening around them. That description feels remarkably modern. Today, people are more connected globally than any generation in history, yet many feel more spiritually disconnected internally. Technology connects devices while isolating individuals emotionally. Social media creates visibility without depth. Communication increases while understanding decreases. And underneath all of it is a growing sense that humanity is losing the ability to think deeply about eternal questions. People think constantly about survival, success, entertainment, politics, trends, and temporary concerns, but rarely about spiritual direction. And that may be exactly what distraction is designed to accomplish. Because distracted societies rarely recognize danger early enough to respond wisely. This is why Jesus repeatedly warned his followers not to become spiritually weighed down by the worries and distractions of life, not because ordinary responsibilities are wrong, but because excessive attachment to temporary concerns blind people to larger realities. Modern culture constantly reinforces temporary thinking. People are taught to focus primarily on personal comfort, personal success, personal pleasure, and short-term goals. But Scripture consistently points humanity beyond temporary existence toward eternal accountability. And that contrast creates tension, because the more society becomes absorbed in temporary distractions, the less interest it has in eternal truth. This may explain why biblical prophecy often feels uncomfortable to modern audiences. Prophecy interrupts normalcy. It challenges assumptions of permanence. It reminds humanity that civilizations are not invincible and moral choices carry consequences. But modern society prefers reassurance over warning. People want comfort, certainty, and stability. They want to believe systems will continue functioning indefinitely. They want to believe humanity will eventually solve every problem through advancement and progress. Yet despite all technological advancement, humanity's deeper spiritual condition appears increasingly unstable. Fear increases, loneliness increases, corruption increases, confusion increases, distrust increases, violence increases, and despite endless information, wisdom often feels absent. Which leads to a sobering realization. Perhaps humanity's greatest problem is not lack of intelligence, but lack of spiritual awareness during a time when awareness matters most. There is another reason many people continue acting as though everything is normal. Comfort creates illusion. As long as daily routines continue functioning, people naturally assume deeper collapse cannot happen. Grocery stores remain open, technology still works, entertainment continues, jobs continue, life moves forward, and because normal systems still operate externally, many assume society itself remains stable internally. But appearances can be deceptive. The Titanic looked stable shortly before disaster became unavoidable. Ancient civilizations appeared powerful before sudden decline accelerated faster. Empires throughout history maintained external strength while internal corruption quietly weakened them beneath the surface. And Scripture repeatedly warns about this exact pattern. In Revelation, one of the churches believed it was spiritually healthy because outwardly everything appeared successful. Yet spiritually, it was described as blind, poor, and unaware of its true condition. That warning extends far beyond religion. It reflects a universal human tendency to mistake external stability for internal health. Modern society may be doing exactly that. Technology creates convenience but not wisdom. Wealth creates comfort but not peace. Entertainment creates stimulation but not fulfillment. Progress creates efficiency but not morality. And despite all external advancement, humanity still struggles with the same spiritual issues that destroyed civilizations throughout history. Pride, greed, violence, corruption, lust for power, moral confusion. The difference today is scale. Modern systems allow these problems to spread globally faster than ever before.
One conflict affects economies worldwide. One ideological shift influences entire generations instantly through digital platforms. One crisis can reshape emotional conditions across nations overnight. And because everything moves so quickly, people rarely stop long enough to evaluate where society is actually heading. That lack of reflection may be one of the most dangerous conditions of all. Because civilizations do not drift accidentally. They drift gradually through repeated choices, repeated compromises, and repeated neglect of foundational truths. And once enough moral compromise accumulates, decline begins accelerating beneath the surface, long before collapse becomes obvious externally. Jesus warned that deception would increase dramatically in the last days. But deception does not work by appearing obviously false. It works by blending comfortably into normal life until people stop questioning it. And modern culture excels at this. People consume ideas constantly without evaluating their long-term spiritual effects. Values shift gradually through repetition. Morality changes through normalization. Convictions weaken through exposure. And eventually, society adapts so completely that previous standards begin feeling unfamiliar. That transformation is happening globally right now. And perhaps the most alarming part is how ordinary it all feels. Because when spiritual decline becomes culturally normal, warning signs no longer create urgency. People continue routines while foundations weaken underneath them. Exactly like previous civilizations before collapse. Exactly like the days before biblical judgment narratives. And maybe that similarity is not accidental.
At the center of all these warnings is one repeated biblical theme. Humanity becomes most vulnerable when it feels most comfortable. Not because comfort itself is evil, but because comfort often creates spiritual complacency. People stop watching carefully, stop questioning deeply, stop recognizing warning signs. They begin assuming tomorrow will always look like today. That assumption can be dangerous. Jesus repeatedly emphasized suddenness in his teachings about the last days. Not suddenness because signs were absent, but suddenness because people ignored the significance of the signs surrounding them. Life continued normally until disruption arrived unexpectedly. And perhaps that is what makes this generation so unique. Never before has humanity possessed so much information while remaining so spiritually distracted at the same time. People can access endless knowledge instantly, yet many rarely pause long enough to reflect on eternal meaning. Attention is fragmented constantly. Entertainment never stops. Distraction fills nearly every silent moment. And silence matters, because awareness often grows in stillness, not noise. Yet modern life is structured around constant stimulation, notifications, media, entertainment, opinions, trends, endless movement preventing deeper reflection. And without reflection, people rarely evaluate where culture is heading spiritually. But the direction matters, because societies eventually become shaped by what they repeatedly normalize. And today, normalization is happening rapidly across nearly every area of culture. Things that once created concern now barely create reaction. Instability becomes expected. Corruption becomes routine. Moral confusion becomes ordinary. And perhaps most significantly, prophecy becomes easy to ignore because people become emotionally adapted to the conditions prophecy describes. That adaptation may explain why so many biblical warnings feel strangely relevant today. Not because one isolated event fulfills prophecy completely, but because multiple conditions are converging simultaneously. Moral decline, spiritual distraction, emotional numbness, deception, false security, cultural confusion, global instability, all developing together in ways previous generations rarely experienced at this scale. And when these conditions converge, awareness becomes critically important. Because Scripture never presents prophecy merely as information. Prophecy is meant to awaken discernment, to encourage reflection, to remind humanity that civilizations are not permanent and moral direction matters deeply. The real danger is not simply that the world is changing. The real danger is humanity becoming so distracted by normal life that it no longer recognizes the significance of those changes. That is exactly what happened in Noah's generation, exactly what happened before multiple biblical judgments, and according to Jesus, exactly what will happen again before the end. People will continue eating, drinking, buying, selling, building, planning, scrolling, entertaining themselves, and pursuing ordinary routines while deeper instability grows underneath the surface of society, until suddenly what seemed normal no longer feels stable at all. And by then, many will realize too late that the signs were never hidden. Humanity simply became too distracted to recognize them clearly.